So I can't believe I had the audacity of reading Middlemarch by George Eliot, closing the cover, sitting on it for a couple days after I finished it, going to Goodreads to write my review, and then clicking on 4 stars like a fucking idiot. I'm so mad at myself for doing that. Like, how did I do that? Why? Why would someone read this book and give it anything other than 5? It makes no sense. I make no sense. Past Rick, you're a goddamn idiot. As you can tell from my tone of voice, I'm a little worked up. So I already know this isn't going to be one of those videos where I have a really solid through line as I talk about the book. So instead, what I'm going to do is present my 13 thoughts on Middlemarch by George Eliot. And while I have you here, I should mention that this is the next book in my top 125 books of all time series. I don't think I've made one of these videos in maybe 2020. I don't know if I've made one all year, but I've decided to pick that project back up. If you don't know what that is, I'll put a link to it down below where I talk about it more in depth. Basically, I'm trying to read the top 125 novels of all time. That list I got from compiling a bunch of different lists. It's a whole big kind of thing. There's a whole other video that explains it, so if you're interested in it, just check it out. If you just want to see Middlemarch, let's do it. Most accounts of Middlemarch that I've seen try to kind of encapsulate the plot of the book, and I really think that's doing the book a disservice. It ends up being a really dull summary of really complicated plot lines, and that's really not what the book is about, and I feel like it's selling it in a way it was never really meant to. Trying to describe what reading Middlemarch is like trying to describe to a dead person what it's like being alive. Like, it's something you have to experience in order to really get it, unfortunately. So I'm not going to spend the start of this video telling you what Middlemarch is about. If you're interested in that, go read a summary. I'll let other people do that. I'm not going to do that here. This video is already going to be way too long. I'm not going to bog it down with a summary of any kind. I'm already bogging it down, talking about how I'm not going to do a summary, so let's just move on. I think one of the important things to remember when reading Middlemarch is its subtitle, which is a study of provincial life. This is very much the story of a time and a place told through this kind of large cast of characters. And I think this is where Eliot's genius really shines. After reading Middlemarch, I can't tell you who the monarch was during this story, but I can close my eyes and I can put myself in Middlemarch and I can turn around and I can see it and I can feel it. And it's like I've been there for the last 10 days reading this book. Coming from a small town, I know what it's like to have like this full scope feeling of a place. And it's really hard, I think, to describe to people what that feels like for people who may be in a big city and they don't know what that is exactly like. But now I can just give them Middlemarch because somehow Eliot was able to capture that feeling without really talking about it. She just shows you what that's like. And that's something that I don't think would have been a selling point to me as a reader before I read it. And maybe even as it was happening, I wasn't really fully appreciating. It's one of those things where the book went from a 4-star to a 5-star as I thought about it and kind of realized like what a huge accomplishment that is and how hard that is to do and make interesting and not tedious at all. The difference between, say, a Virginia Woolf and a George Eliot is that Virginia Woolf is really famous for taking consciousness of a human being and putting that onto a page that you can then read and be like, wow, like that's what it's like to have a human brain. And with Middlemarch, George Eliot really shows us what it's like to live as a human being. It's amazing to see a writer so perceptive of the people around them and the people of this time 40 years before she actually was writing this book. And what Eliot shows you is that perceptiveness and knowledge of another person is just so key for having sympathy and empathy toward that person. If you don't see someone, you don't care about that person. If you don't truly see who they are, if you don't get who they are or try to get who they are, you're never going to care what happens to them. And whether you care about them or not, Eliot makes you get everyone in this story. And compassion, I think, becomes a really huge theme of the book, like asking that of its characters, and I think asking that of its readers. There are some characters in this book, if I had to describe them to you, don't sound sympathetic. They don't sound like people you would care about based on what they're like, some of the things that they do. But Eliot kind of pulls back the curtain, shows you who they really are and how they got to be that way. And sometimes it almost feels impossible not to sympathize with people. It's amazing. It's so beautiful. I can't believe how well she does it. The book is kind of very much divided between a cast of older characters and a cast of younger characters. And we get to see these people both inwardly and outwardly. We see them make good choices. We see them make really bad choices, whether they marry well or whether they marry poorly, whether they gain wisdom or over time, like saddening to the point of just like crumbling. I've heard one of the major themes of the book described as the transition from innocence to experience, and I see where they're going, but it feels a little bit too simplistic to me. Experience hasn't given them all peace, but what I think experience does for the reader is give them that ammunition that they need to feel something for those characters. But one of the most amazing thing that Eliot does in this book is use herself as kind of a first-person vocal narrator when she needs to kind of comment on what's happening. Literally, the voice of George Eliot comes into the story to tell you maybe not to judge this person as harshly as you want to, or maybe to say that like, just wait, things are gonna happen that might make you feel differently. It's a really interesting narrative device, and I can't remember the last book that I've read that actually did that. I think it's really hard to do convincingly, and that's why you don't see it very often, but Eliot does it to like, just perfection. As an example of Eliot doing this, after Dorothea marries Casaubon, we're naturally pulled into the story through Dorothea, and we're really interested in seeing her, I think, inner struggle as she gets into this marriage that seems flawed from the start, but pretty quickly, Eliot kind of steps into the story to tell you to kind of be aware of the prejudice that you're bringing into this. One morning, some weeks after her arrival at Lowick, Dorothea, but why always Dorothea? Was her point of view the only possible one with regard to this marriage? I protest against all our interest, all our effort at understanding being given to the young skins that look blooming in spite of trouble. For those too will get faded, and will know the older and more eating griefs which we are helping to neglect. In spite of the blinking eyes and the white moles, objectionable to Celia, and the want of muscular curve which was morally painful to Sir James, Mr. Casaubon had an intense consciousness within him, and was spiritually a-hungered like the rest of us. She points out quite often, we never know the kind of silent troubles that another person is going through. So don't judge someone too harshly before you really, really know what they've gone through. It's like, don't, until you've walked a mile in their shoes kind of thing. And then within a couple of pages, we're kind of pulled out of that person's head. And then that person is then just seen kind of walking by on the street. And then they're back to being just a neighbor. And that's all you kind of know them as. And you never kind of connect to them that way again. It's like this amazing ability to just like put you in people and just like place you all over Middlemarch and just let you feel what everyone is going through, and you're never really overwhelmed. I thought it was really interesting to analyze the mutual maybe misunderstandings of the two main marriages in the story, that between Casaubon and Dorothea, and the other between Rosamond and Lydgate. The first is a really convincing marriage because Eliot does, as I said, show you kind of both sides of it, why it really works and why it really doesn't work for both of these people. While the Lydgate's marriage is really built on attraction and maybe even a bit of a mirroring of selfishness in the two of them. And then a lack of money starts to affect this marriage, and Eliot shows how financial troubles will just like squeeze the life out of a lot of relationships. No matter how close you were, for some people, that issue can just destroy you. Rosamond and Lydgate's marriage is just this like really ordinary workaday tragedy that you get to see. Prosperity in Middlemarch, just as it is in real life, is very sought after. It's very envied, but she shows you just how precarious a relationship built on that can be. I just want to come back to that idea of George Eliot putting herself into the narrative because it's so interesting. I just want to keep talking about it. As another example of her doing this, I'm thinking of when Sir James is kind of really desperate to take on Dorothea's idea of providing cottages for the poor, even though she has gone on to marry another man, which bothers him. Eliot kind of jumps into the story to let you know that, like, James isn't just doing this to get on her good side. There's more to it than that. And she says, doubtless this persistence was the best course for his own dignity, but pride only helps us to be generous. It never makes us so, any more than vanity makes us witty. So Eliot just kind of jumps in just to tell us, like, pretty bluntly, this is what we're all like. We all do this. You have that in you, so do the work to see that in other people and don't think the worst of them all the time. I find everyone just has this complex of, like, their life and their own moral compass is so much more complicated and nuanced than everyone around them, when in reality, like, they're every bit as complicated and nuanced as you are, probably. I think a lot of readers will find it bothersome, or do find it bothersome, maybe even disturbing, that the character that they grow to sympathize with the most, Mr. Casaubon, is probably the one that they also disdain the most. And I feel like Eliot is having so much fun with that. Casaubon just has this lofty goal that he's trying to attain, much in the way that Dorothea has a goal and Lydgate has a goal, but his inability to let anyone else's thoughts or opinions pollute his own idea of this goal and how he should attain it ultimately makes his life's work meaningless. And I was just fascinated by this idea of, like, how many people do we know, maybe you're one of them, I feel like this a lot of the time, unfortunately, who will live their entire life and die with few people missing them, without having really accomplished anything, without this feeling that you've made a mark on the world, or kind of have squeezed everything out of it that you could have, and not really being able to understand why this happened or didn't happen. It's like this really bleak feeling that she never really points at, but it's there a lot in this story. And I haven't been able to stop thinking about it, because my wife and I are talking about this all the time, like, kind of feeling like we're middle-class people who should be capable of kind of fulfilling a lot of our dreams in our life, and we're finding that that's not always the case, and that's a lot harder to do than you want it to. And so you're faced with this idea of just, like, the life that you feel like you should have versus the one that you've been given, and having to reconcile that is really hard at times. And Eliot, yeah, she really talks about that in a really interesting way. Doesn't give you any answers, because I'm not sure there are any answers to give, but she ruminates on it quite a bit, and I just found it really fascinating. The entire time I was reading this story, I was kind of shocked that one of the streaming services haven't gotten their hands on this to make a real kind of binge-worthy retelling of Middlemarch. Because it's all there. Like, this has soap opera written all over it. And when I say soap opera, I don't mean like a literal actual soap opera, just like it has all the pieces you want to make a really interesting, like, town and family saga. Like, there's tons of beautiful people and dysfunctional marriages. There's really angry mothers and fathers. There's a lot of shady characters that everyone is trying to deal with. There's doctors and clergy and politicians and rich older family members. People from kind of every social class who interact in all these really interesting ways. And their fates and their choices really affect one another in a way that's just, like, it's just ripe for really dramatic telling. And I don't think the 1994 version of it does it nearly as well as it could. I think my favorite part about Middlemarch, though, is how Eliot tells us that our individual moral choices matter. That our smallest acts, for both good and for bad, can just kind of ripple out from you and have such a big effect on people that maybe you don't even know. COVID. Oh, sorry about that. COVID. Oh, I got a little tickle, sorry. One of the things that bothers me though, after finishing the book and reading kind of other people's take on the story, is maybe some of the arguments that you read for or against Dorothea based on kind of how she ends up in the book. I think one of the criticisms about Dorothea that makes the most sense is that for being such a strong, kind of self-assured woman, she lets herself play second fiddle to men more often than I think current readers would like, which I get. But then when you contextualize this story happening in 1830, it does make like contextual sense, unfortunately, for people who just don't want to see that, which I get. And this next part is one of the only parts of this video that's going to have a spoiler, so I'm gonna grayscale the video. You can skip ahead if you don't want this spoiler. I'm going to talk about the end of the book just a little bit. When the video comes back and it's not gray anymore, I'm past the spoiler. Okay? So at the end of the book, Dorothea is really no further along in her life in terms of like success based on all these really noble intentions that she started with. And that bothers people. And I think Eliot knew that some people were going to feel this, because she kind of throws a line in at the end basically to say, you know, in the grand scheme of things, Dorothea may go on kind of unrecognized in any kind of grand scope, but she helped a lot of people along the way. And I found that ending kind of interesting and kind of thematically consistent based on what I was talking about with Casaubon and the end of his life. Like, not every woman is going to get to the end of their story, the end of their life, and have a life that was as impressive and impactful as maybe George Eliot's was. And I think her writing Dorothea like this is her saying, you don't have to be me to feel like your life is worth something. Eliot is just really showing the value of like a really normal life, and that there is a lot of value in that. You don't have to accomplish this huge grand spectacle of a life to feel like it was worth anything. You don't have to have a ton of money or a ton of fame or a ton of success to feel like you've had a successful life. And I just thought that was beautiful. And I just feel like that's a little bit misunderstood with how some people seem to be taking the ending. I see why they would take it the way that they are, but to me, it's not taking the story as it was meant to be given to you. That's putting your own stuff into it. So in the end, Dorothea marries a man that she's in love with, and she goes on to raise her children, and she's happy with that. To some, that feels like a sad waste, but to me, it feels like the ultimate statement of the major theme of the book, that individual good deeds and moral choices matter. Dorothea's finely touched spirit had still its fine issues, though they were not widely visible. Her full nature, like that river of which Cyrus broke the strength, spent itself in channels which had no great name on the earth. But the effect of her being on those around her was incalculably diffusive, for the growing good of the world is partly dependent on unhistoric acts, and that things are not so ill with you and me as they might have been, is half owing to the number who lived faithfully a hidden life and rest in unvisited tombs. The growing good of the world is partly dependent on unhistoric acts is one of my favorite lines I've ever read in a book. It is so beautiful, and like so many people need to hear that. Like, this reinforced such a like gorgeous moral ethic to me. Like, that is such an important statement for people to hear. And that she's encouraging ordinary people to just never stop doing good is one of the most beautiful, heartwarming, worthwhile reasons for writing a book I've ever seen. I was just talking to someone about this the other day, how too much literary fiction emphasizes things that are sad. And the sadder a story is, the more literary it is. And my argument was that literary fiction needs to appeal to joy and positivity way more than it does. And we were both like, yeah, but how do you do that and make it interesting? Well, Middlemarch is that book. I was laughing as I was reading it, because I was just like, this is exactly what I was saying. This is a dramatic story that's really interesting, but it has this really beautiful humanist soul to it. I just love it. I think the key to reading a book like Middlemarch is just setting aside this like modern proclivity to kind of get through a book and get to the plot and find out what happens and finish it and then move on to the next book. That's just not how to read Middlemarch. I read this book in about 10 days and I wish I actually stretched it out even more. If you're going to read Middlemarch and you haven't yet, I would suggest take it as slowly as you can stand it. Take a few deep breaths. The story was originally told in 8 parts, so it's kind of meant to be taken in chunks, and I think that's like a really interesting way to learn about all these people, to give yourself a bit of time to absorb it. I wish I did. Sit comfortably while you read, try to savor some of these background characters, some of these background details, because by the end, I feel like you're going to be flipping the pages faster and faster because you do want to see what happens. So to do what you can to just slow that process down, at least at the start, I think would be beneficial. For my final point, I just want to read a bunch of quotes that I really love from the book. There's just so much wisdom in this book, and there's so many just unbelievably good one-liners that I just wanted to just share a few of them with you. So if you got to this point in the video and you still haven't read Middlemarch, hopefully hearing some of this stuff will be the tipping point that you need to let you know that this is a book that you just really need to take in, because George Eliot is fantastic. It is a narrow mind which cannot look at a subject from various points of view. That might just end up becoming my new Twitter background, because everyone on social media needs to learn that point. If we had a keen vision and feeling of all ordinary human life, it would be like hearing the grass grow and the squirrel's heartbeat, and we should die of that roar which lies on the other side of silence. A prig is a fellow who is always making you a present of his opinions. Again, another one for Twitter. This is the most like mansplainy 19th century quote of all time. I just laughed. I was just like, this is every man someone complains about on the internet. They should just like send that quote to. Actually, they won't. Those guys won't understand what this means, but you'll laugh at it to yourself. Pride help us. And pride is not a bad thing when it only urges us to hide our own hurts, not to hurt others. I don't make myself disagreeable. It is you who find me so. Disagreeable is a word that describes your feelings and not my actions. It's rather a strong check to one's self-complacency to find how much of one's right doing depends on not being in want of money. She was always trying to be what her husband wished and never able to repose on his delight in what she was. Dorothea, he said to himself, was forever enthroned in his soul. No other woman could sit higher than her footstool. Which is one of the most powerful expressions of love I've read in a really long time. I wrote down the other day just to myself like how I think most writers talk about characters' physical appearance too much when they're having them fall in love. They make it too much of a physical thing when that's not what falling in love feels like. Quotes like that is what falling in love feels like. If you made it this long, Jesus Christ, what are you still doing here? That's insane. Go live your life. And while you do that, go read Middlemarch. This is one of the best books I've read in a really long time. Definitely one of the best books that I've read in 2020. So my name is Rick. Thank you so much for watching. As always, I will be back in a couple days. Until then, happy reading, and I'll see you soon. Bye.